with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today is going to be a really important conversation, and this really was sparked by an article by previous guest, Suze Wilson, and she's a senior lecturer at the School of Management at Massey University. And I reached out to her and Shelley Spiller and Brad Jackson, and I said, hey, I would love to have the three of you come on. And Brad said, I'd love to come on and join you for a conversation. I think we're in the midst of a fascinating case study. So what we have here is Suze Wilson, and we have Brad Jackson from the University of Waikato, and they are going to help us make sense of some of the leadership challenges and some of the situation that's happening in New Zealand right now. I couldn't think of better people to really help me better understand the situation. So, Suze, maybe we start with you today. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for doing the incredible work that you do. We're going to put some links to some of your writing into the show notes so listeners can check in with that. But maybe we start by the two of you providing a little bit of kind of background on why she is so important to New Zealand, but also just globally, and how she is incredibly relevant right now on the global stage.
Kia ora, Scott. Thanks for your interest in this topic. So Ardern, she's now no longer our Prime Minister. The transition to a new one has taken place. But right throughout her role as leader of the Labour Party and then shortly thereafter as Prime Minister, she has attracted a lot of attention beyond New Zealand, partly because, she was a relatively young woman who all of a sudden was the head of a major political party 2 months out from an election which it looked like they didn't stand a chance of winning. And then she actually managed to pull the votes up because people were, I think, drawn to her energy and the kinds of values and vision that she was articulating for the future of the country. They managed to pull off a coalition deal, and all of a sudden she was the Prime Minister. And then a few months after that, she announced that she was pregnant. She was only the first woman leader, head of state in history after Benazir Bhutto to have a child in office. And that was, something that kind of people looked to New Zealand and went, wow, isn't that fantastic? You can have a young woman who's a head of state and she can actually also have a child, perform her job and, be accepted as such. So there was some beautiful images of Ardern with her young baby off to visit, speaking at the United Nations. And when she was pregnant, she went to visit the Queen. So there was some, kind of really powerful imagery that started spreading about her right early on from her tenure. And then the Christchurch terror attacks happened. The world saw, rather than a thoughts and prayers kind of response, a response that demonstrated genuine empathy and concern, which sought to wrap care around the victims who were primarily members of the Muslim community, and to act decisively in relation to gun control. So, all of that built her reputation. She started to really be seen sort of as the anti-Trump, a different kind of leader. So, yeah, she's throughout her whole tenure, she's attracted a lot of interest from people around the world.
Brad, when we had our conversation, gosh, this might be almost a year and a half ago, it was at the height of COVID, and we talked about even her response to COVID-19. At the time, I remember you provided me with this image of millions of people rowing in the same direction. Like there was a vision of how to respond to this. And even in that emergency, you were talking about your respect for her ability to navigate the crisis situation.
Yeah, and I think there was a strong personal dimension, because I think I'd mentioned to you, I left Australia, had 3 days to leave, as I came here earlier than I anticipated, got here a day before lockdown, and I was reflecting on my wife and I sitting, most relieved because we weren't sure we were going to get on the plane or what was going to happen, and sitting there watching the evening news and seeing Jacinda and Ashley Bloomfield, who was our chief medical officer, Minister of Health, and just that feeling, the whole approach was so different to what I was experiencing in Australia. With Scott Morrison, by the way, I know a lot of very nice Scots, but so Scott, but just the whole feeling was very different here. And that in Australia, it was really focusing on the 10% that were getting behind this, whereas in New Zealand, it was focusing on the 90% who were. And there was a sense of pride, that and a sense of collective responsibility as well. And globally, actually saying, what, that we're all facing this. We have a chance here to help the rest of the world in terms of how you can respond to these things. And I just want to commend, it's a fantastic series that you've created, Scott, and a great platform for this, but also my colleague Suze has done an awesome job of actually showing the benefits of an academic critical perspective on making sense of what happened during that period and then onwards too. And in particular, the article that Sue's just recently written about the resignation and the fallout and the kind of situation there. So, yeah, in terms of creating a sense of a common cause and really bringing the whole country together, I've never experienced anything like that. I guess people talk about the Blitz in London under Churchill and all these other kinds of things, but there was a sense that we were coming together, doing something very important, not only for New Zealand, but globally too. And so, yeah, I guess I've got a personal connection, and I'm very grateful. The other thing I think I mentioned to you at the time was Jacinda is one of our esteemed alumna from the University of Waikato, our communications program here. So it's that felt, and she's very much of the Waikato as well, and so there was going back to that place-based approach to leadership. I think she exemplified that beautifully. So yeah, it's not only a kind of an critically academic attachment, it's very personal for me, and I know it is for Suze too as well. It mattered. And I think, if you think about that, she made political leadership relevant to a lot of people who felt shut out from political leadership, particularly young people, women, those that were kind of perceived to be on the margins of societies, and also just struck a chord with our Indigenous Pacifica community as well, LGBTQI. All of these, there was this sort of feeling that I think she sparked an interest in sections of society that were pretty well outside of political leadership. And I think that's something that we're not only also with the mosque response as well, the Christchurch mosque response, but just this feeling that actually this matters. And I should be in on this too, which, speaking to big undergraduate classes, you mentioned Jacinda, and the attention level goes up, in a way that hadn't gone up for a while too. So I just feel that there was this moment at actual political leadership was critical, and we all had a role to play in that too. And so that was a very special moment that I'm very grateful to her for what she did there for us.
Well, and a couple times now you've mentioned the mosque attacks. I mean, we have a woman who is entering a leadership role at just unprecedented contextual shifts, whether it's the mosque attacks, volcanic explosion that occurred. I just watched a movie on Netflix, a documentary about that, which was fascinating to observe. We have COVID. So you have an individual who not only has a lot of contextual shifts at home, but she's navigating it's monumental.
There's this old saying we all know, right, about, how crises pose a true test of a leader's, character and skill. And then if you like, layer on top of that the kind of suspicion, really, about whether a woman leader would be tough enough to handle a crisis, the whole notion that somehow women are weak and emotional. So I think Ardern's legacy in relation to crisis leadership is not only to show us a different way of leading in crises, but also to absolutely put paid to the presumption that women are not actually hellishly damn good, potentially in a crisis, at least in part because what she's done every time there has been a crisis is that she has centred an ethics of care right as pivotal lens through which she's communicating with people about what's going on and how we should try to make sense of it. But also, I think, in terms of guiding decision-making to try and discern, well, what is the right thing to do here? So the mosque attack in particular, my understanding is she was at an event in the northern half of New Zealand. We're two main islands for those who don't know that. So she was in the middle of the North Island at an event when she was given a phone call that there was a shooting event in Christchurch, which is in the middle of the South Island. And within a couple of hours, once it became public, her first kind of press conference in response to that, already she had, if you like, framed the moral significance and the strategic significance of the event by saying this is probably going to be our worst day, but also saying they are us. Rather than othering the victims, she's trying to encourage all of us to wrap our arms around a community which actually is a very small community within our country and which, of course, has been subjected to Islamophobic prejudice and abuse. She was immediately trying to reframe the situation in a way that was focused on the victim and immediately, abhorring the actions of the terrorist. She took another, I think, clear moral stance in saying that she would never say his name, and she's trying to encourage us to understand that what he wanted was fame, what he wanted was attention, and actually he doesn't deserve it. People that deserve our attention are the victims and their families. So, I think a really significant example of a leader being able to use, their own kind of ethical and moral compass to make sense of what was an incredibly confusing situation. I mean, there was no clear, from a security perspective, there was no clear information for many hours. Was it just a one-off person attack? We didn't know if there were other mosques throughout the rest of the country that were going to be attacked. So it was an incredibly frightening time, but she was calm, she was clear. You could tell she was very determined that things were going to be done, that this would not stand. The level of outrage that had been committed on our shores was intolerable.
Talk a little bit about your perception of her response with COVID and to the volcanic eruption. How did she respond that really stood out for either one of you?
With the volcanic thing, I mean, she did what I guess most leaders will do, is she turned up, she was present. But I think, because of the trust that she had built in people's minds through her response to the mosque shooting, when she turned up and demonstrated care for those affected by the volcanic explosion, it felt real. There was a sense that this was authentic, that this wasn't just a bit of spin doctoring for the cameras, that, she was someone who really cared about situations. She also grasped that there were many tourists affected and therefore there would be, a lot of international attention. And so I think she was conscious of wanting to display to the international community that the New Zealand government was doing everything that it possibly could to care for its citizens who'd been hurt on our place. With the pandemic, as Brad has said, the way she was able to build collective understanding and build collective effort around some really kind of simple principles about that we're trying to save lives and livelihoods with our approach, and that you all have a role to play in this, trying to keep people informed, making sure that science was leading the, if you like, the technical aspects of the response, that, we weren't actually she wasn't going to do a Trump and say, oh, look, I Googled something and maybe you want to, down some bloody bleach and then the ivermectin and all that kind of nonsense. And it was clear that she's not a scientist herself, but she was understanding what the scientists were trying to tell her and being able to translate that into not only policy decisions, but communications to the general public. So that initial response was extraordinary. We did have one of the strictest lockdowns with the highest level of compliance, and we leveraged, our strategic advantage of being an island state to enormous effect. We didn't squander it the way other island states like Britain did. I saw a recent analysis that said, had we taken a similar approach to Britain had in that first wave and throughout the rest of 2020 and really most of 2021 until people were vaccinated, the estimate is another 15,000 New Zealanders would have died. As it is, our total death toll is around 3,300, I think, at the moment. So it wasn't really until we'd been fully vaccinated, we'd got through a very difficult Delta lockdown, and the Omicron came along, and there was a massive adaptation in the policy response at that stage. But, we'd largely built a level of immunity that helped mitigate, if you like, the worst of it.
But I'd say she doesn't do framing capital F. She frames intuitively. It's a very embodied, very much there, present, just like anyone else, as opposed to, the line of police commissioners, fire commissioners, and you get, everybody. She's there, she's present, runs through her. And I think that exactly the huge personal and physiological cost, emotional cost, massive. If you're all in, you can't fake that kind of framing. It's there. So by being embodied, that you lay yourself open, but you're also, and that, to be honest, and we'll talk about, the resignation, but I was genuinely concerned for about 6 months about her health, just in terms of how she was. And let's not underestimate the personal cost that was required to be able to create that authentic leadership that Suze talked about. And I think the other would be, we did quite a lot of appreciative inquiry. She was very appreciative. In other words, so it wasn't so much, we were looking for compliance, but really what she was celebrating was commitment with examples of, noticing what was going on in different parts of Aotearoa and bringing attention to what people were doing, going beyond duty. They call it duty, Suze, and she did it in a way, I think. So it was like inviting people to get behind this, and it wasn't an invitation, it wasn't you should, but actually acknowledging and appreciating the level of commitment which she was being and celebrating that too, but doing it very much hand in hand. I think Suze was a superb example of co-leadership with Ashley Broomfield and, the science, but just saying we do this together. So, yeah, I just think it's an interesting point when you think about those crisis leadership. And I know historically people have said crisis really, as Suze says, brings out is the ultimate acid test of leaders and leadership. But the problem is when you're perceived to be so effectively leading crises and responding, when you don't have an obvious crisis, what happens? How do people respond? Go back to Churchill again, great in wartime, but wasn't the right person in peacetime. And this is the conventional wisdom. I'm not suggesting there is a bit of a conventional wisdom. It's brilliant in a crisis, but what happens after? So I think that's something to, certainly textbook plus genuine crisis leadership, but then beyond that, combination of physiological challenge and maintaining momentum.
Suze, when we spoke for the first time, it was after the truckers event in Canada, and then you were telling me about some incidents that occurred in New Zealand, and it seems like there was this kind of contextual shift and got vicious. And as the
Yeah.
context shifts and gets vicious, it's no longer just people in New Zealand being vicious. You literally have the world, right? Any bad actor from China or Iran or in North Korea can begin stirring the pot and it gets vicious. Is that an accurate assessment? Was there a contextual shift that she then had to navigate some white waters that were?
Yes. Yeah. So in 2020, when the pandemic starts, the first lockdown, and we come out of that with zero COVID in the community. So, and closed borders to try and keep it out. And we basically have this pretty luxurious dream run through the rest of 2020 and most of 2021. We're kind of looking at the rest of the world going, oh my God, there's so many people dying. But here we were incredibly safe. But because, we're all networked, people are also noticing all the kind of anti-government, anti-COVID, anti-COVID protection, anti-science kind of discourse that is playing out in other countries, and it's seeping in here. And when we had a Delta outbreak in August of 2021, which resulted in a very extended period of lockdown in Auckland, which is our largest city. During that period, those that track and trace what's going on in disinformation and kind of conspiracy networks, we're seeing a huge uptick in engagement with that kind of stuff. And so we started seeing anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination stuff really reaching a much higher level of intensity and a much broader reach than before. And then that all kind of reaches a fever pitch in February 2022 with the parliamentary kind of convoy lockdown. Just to very briefly say, that was very nearly our January 6th. It was very close to the police losing control of the situation. But it had a radicalising effect. And so, throughout the rest of 2022, it became increasingly difficult for Ardern to go and engage in public events without encountering, abusive protesters. The stuff online was there. And in some sense, and I'm not saying our opposition parties were spreading conspiracy theories, they were not, but they were leveraging that level of distrust and discontent. They're pushing hard on the fact that now we had inflation and the government wasn't controlling the cost of living crisis, if you like, completely ignoring that many of those things are actually quite difficult for a government to manage when they're driven by events in Russia and the Ukraine, right? But there was this just growing groundswell of discontent. Her party was falling behind in the polls. This kind of narrative developed around her that she was a divisive leader. I think that I have a problem with that because actually her behaviour is never divisive. She is kind of very much kind of the calm one in the room looking for middle ground. But, people are wanting to express their opposition in quite extreme manners. That's where the divisiveness comes from, is actually the way they're choosing to express themselves. All of last year really was I think, a really difficult time. And it must have weighed upon her, the level of abuse that was coming her way in some way, shape or form. The fact that there were even protests held at schools, really nasty stuff playing out in front of children, which I'm sure she would have been really upset about, that somehow her presence at the school was creating this nastiness that children were exposed to.
Suze's point about the internet, social media, the dark side, how that's very much a global phenomenon. And New Zealand sort of always prided itself as being, well, we would never do that. Never be like that here, like it is in the States or in the UK or Australia. In Australia, it's sort of like, and yet I think those influencing that positioning became it obviously persuaded. And what surprised me was, the way, in fact, they're always the fringe, it could be the 5% or whatever, but that kind of, I guess, competition for what's really going on started to persuade more and more of the middle ground. It is interesting, as leadership scholars, we get virtual leadership, but we don't really get it. We haven't really started to understand the influence that has and the dynamics. And with the Jacinda case, I don't want to use this as a case, but the richer would be to look at what are the motivations for followers that, those that what's going on there in terms of the drive, people that had been actually supporting, actively celebrating Jacinda and what we were doing, to suddenly, why did that shift? Why did that? What was the turning point around that? And there's an awful lot going on emotionally for people. There's the insecurity of the economic future, a whole bunch of things. And so what really, we've had some recent conversations about this, Suze. We're just very concerned about the sort of standard of basic decent behavior and discussion. So people, the social media will bring the worst out of people, it's occasionally the best, but it's when it starts to permeate in what goes on in the street, when you're lining up for in the grocery, or when, you see someone complaining about someone, shouting at someone on the street. It just never happened when I first arrived here. And yet it seems to be becoming normal. So it's all part of, I think, people have pent up frustration, we've done this, we've come through this, and now, I think that shift, and the fact that it's happened in the middle, reasonable, the quiet New Zealand, get on with it. That's what's worried me. And that's, I think, what as Suze says, I was pleased when we had the protests that there was a united focus from politicians, but it all started to come unstuck and start to unravel, and people start to exploit this in a way I think was, it's in a way natural political capital, but it's not the way we've generally done things here, and it's not what we're about. So that's the thing that I think most exercises me, and I know Suze and a few others that we've talked, but this is not on. This is not what we're about. It's not what we stand for. But I just think we've only begun to really scratch what is really going on there. And I think we as leadership scholars need to get into that and understand that it's murky, it's unpleasant, it's hostile, but it's got huge implications for democracy generally. Around, you can't seal it off. You can seal a pandemic response to a certain extent, but you can't seal this ideological ferment globally. We need to be much smarter in terms of understanding, but also finding ways to address it. I think that's the piece that I'm taking more richly from the Jacinda, in addition to superb exemplary crisis leadership. But there's sort of the two things I think are really important for us to learn: the positive, but also some of the negative things that are happening now. What do we learn from that? What do we do about that? It's important for us in New Zealand, but it's important globally as well.
Well, and it seems that there was just kind of ever worsening sexism, misogyny that she was being subjected to. Again, some of this behavior becoming more normalized, or some of the social media normalizing some of this behavior, where again, I can be anywhere in the world and just hurling horrible content that, Suze, how do you make sense of that? I mean, it's very, very troubling.
Yeah, it's important we not understate in any way just how vile the stuff that she was being subjected to was. So the researchers at the Disinformation Project published a report in November last year that had some of roughly the 30-odd keywords that they were tracking that were used in relation to Ardern as a key target. So the C word was the number one word. Most of the other words, associated with some kind of death or murder or rape, her child's name is on that list. The Christchurch terrorist's name is on that list as one of their heroes. So they're enmeshed in this incredibly hateful discourse. And I do think that maybe part of what is going on here is that there was a period of time, particularly with the pandemic, where people were scared. We were quite rightfully really scared about what risk it posed to us, and we were wrapped up safe, the borders shut, and Auntie Jacinda, if you like, or Mum, was kind of looking after us, and we were kind of dependent on her. And I wonder if part of what's going on for people is that they just can't bear being dependent on a woman. And so what you've got, if you like, then is this kind of huge counter-reaction, this, refusal to give her any space, to give her any legitimacy, to listen to anything that she's got to say. So it is this kind of actually this huge backlash about, oh my God, I was relying on that woman, and she's just a girl in a skirt, or she's a witch, or she's a shape-shifting lizard person, or whatever nonsense it is that they're caught up in. So I think there's something going on, I think, for people, that having to listen to a woman issue instructions, having to see a woman make decisions on, difficult policy issues. There's just this fundamental, how dare she? How dare that woman tell me what to do? And so I think there's just, and that's just that basic kind of underlying misogynistic, women should not be having a say in this stuff. They should be docile and submissive and silent. There's this really kind of raw, kind of misogynistic, patriarchal tension that's in there. And to be very clear, it's not only coming from men. It is very definitely, there are plenty of women who express hatred towards her as well. And, there is research, that helps us unpack why women might do that. If she can achieve that, it says something to me that I can't. So I have to tear her down, because in tearing her down, I make myself feel better.
I was thinking, Suze, about you described beautifully adolescent rage,
Yes.
Actually verging on toddler rage.
Yes.
And I've always been struck by the slight passive-aggressive undercurrents in Aotearoa, because on the surface, everybody's very pleasant and nice, but we do see people, particularly this sort of notion of, we call it tall poppy, but this ambiguity people have about authority and authority figures generally, because one of the key drivers here in New Zealand, founding New Zealand, was creating autonomy. That was and equality and all these kinds of things. I just want to add another dimension to that, Suze, because there was a feeling that because she was getting so much international attention, being held up as an exemplary leader, and in a world where there weren't many exemplary leaders, she was, the UN, Queen, the various prime ministers. I mean, she was, and to be honest, it's interesting because we should be feeling, well, we're getting great recognition for a New Zealand leader. But going back to the sort of psychodynamic, I think people felt jealous that she was being recognized. She's giving this attention here. Great for her, but what about us stuck here and where we're facing? And so there is an element there, I think, about, because I think a lot of people who aren't New Zealanders would say, well, what's going on here? I mean, you've got someone here that we're desperate to have as our leader. What the hell are you? Why are people unhappy around that? But I think there is a sort of an anger. And as you say, I think you're bang on, Suze, people just being really scared, really terrified and feeling reassured. And then all of a sudden feeling this, this has to emanate in some kind of hostility or some kind of frustration. But the international profile, funnily enough, I think served to stoke for these people who felt left out, felt, that were being let down, and mum, auntie. I don't want to get into too much of that, but I think there's something very deep down there that's well beyond the sort of conventional psychological explanations of, and I think it's the thing that we need to better understand if we are to find ways to channel that.
The other important contextual features, of course, there were things that the government was doing that people quite legitimately and reasonably would say that's not good enough, or I disagree. So I'm not suggesting for one moment that every decision that she's made is perfect or right or necessarily the best. That's fine. It's the way that people have chosen to express their dissent that is the problem, and that it shows there's such a hugely gendered characteristic to that. We can't understand the situation if we don't pay attention to that stuff.
What's fascinating to me, or what I kind of come back to, is how do you succeed? I don't want to say in this context, but we are in a space where there's been reports that she'll probably need security for the rest of her life, for her and her family. I mean, because of the death threats, and it's just, who wants to lead? Well, you're going to have only narcissists and really people who are not well psychologically raising their hand, because what we're subjecting our leaders to is horrible, and what they are subjected to is horrible. And I think that's another opportunity for scholars. These folks, regardless of your political affiliation, what they're enduring, what their families are enduring, it's damaging. It's damaging. And it ranges from horrible to just bad.
Yeah, I mean that's the bigger picture, and the kind of the legacy worry, isn't it? Is that we know that Ardern was the number one target, but we also know that other women MPs and MPs who are people of colour, are also particularly at risk. of this same kind of vitriol. And the more it becomes normalized, the more it's just, well, that's how we treat people in public life. And actually, yeah, as you say, if we want to have decent human beings in public life, then we actually need to treat them like decent human beings should. So it's really concerning. I think the thing that's so concerning about what's happened here is that New Zealand is not a country that has got, like the decade of deep divisiveness that, say, the US has seen or Britain in relation to the Brexit. This has happened in an extremely short period of time, and Ardern was re-elected in late 2020 with an outright majority, which was the first time that had happened in the 20-odd years that we've had, 30-odd years we've had MMP. I can't remember, it was 2030. The erosion of civil discourse has happened really, really rapidly, and it is really clear that there are foreign influences in this, and I'm not being conspiratorial necessarily saying we know that money is coming. We do know that money is coming from Steve Bannon to support one of the major disinformation broadcasters here. They're very happy to brag about that, so thanks, Bannon. It's also really noticeable the extent to which they are spouting Putin's talking points with respect to Ukraine. So even if they're not getting money from Russia, spreading Russian disinformation, they're spreading Putin-esque propaganda in our country, and that's not helpful. What is already a difficult job of leading, right? Just nigh on impossible, and that's not good for all of us, any of us.
I guess, the thought occurred to me is I think Suze's point about how it's happened so quickly, so compressed, so it hasn't been properly processed. And I guess, Suze, one of the things that I don't think there was a lot of attention around Jacinda's resignation and people recognizing, the hostility of the office, misogynistic behavior, and a whole bunch of things. But it's amazing in 2 weeks with a new leader, and it happens to be a male, Chris Hipkins. We have two leaders, one's called Chris, both called Chris, Greta Lux and Chris Hipkins, and that it's like, and the polls have already gone up for Labour, male. Oh, and the way, we'll get back to basic, that this kind of agenda, and it's just, so it's reinforcing exactly what you're saying, Suze, about how this is, quote, this healing. I do think it was significant there was only one person who stood up to be the leader, and you might say, well, actually, that's a sign of a party that's united and integrated. But if people say to me, "Do you have a criticism of Jacinda?" and I would say it was the ability to be able to create a very strong cabinet and caucus, because my time spent in Wellington, that's probably the thing that most impressed me, is that you can focus on a leader, but it's about that cabinet and it's about that broader caucus. And when you're so focused on that kind of distal leadership versus that proximal leadership, globally, and without a lot of that kind of, quote, political management piece. And I'd say there was a weakness. That's probably an area that I would say. So, we're creating the strongest collective leadership platform.
Yes.
And that's often a problem when you've got someone who is so leader focused in terms of that. I'm not saying she did that by design, but I'm just saying, so it's interesting that where were the heir apparents? Where was that? We were looking around thinking, well, who else, A, would be crazy enough to do this, and B, have that. And thankfully, Chris Hipkins, he was a student union president when I was at Victoria many years ago. And we're lucky to have that as a successor. But I just feel that I'm most concerned about the future of democracy here, and in particular, going back to the impacts that this has had on younger people, school kids, even my grandchildren. They've seen this, and I just wonder about the effect it's going to have, a long-term effect on their attitudes towards leadership and to democracy. That's something we really need to grasp.
The chances of having a, if you like, left of centre female prime minister in the next decade are extremely low, because those left of centre parties would just look at it and go, what is this going to cost us? Just despite, if you like, whatever skills and competencies the candidate might have, we have seen that immediate bounce in the polls because she's been replaced by a man. a man who was also strongly associated with the COVID response, right, which supposedly was the thing that was agitating people. Therefore, the chances are that actually if we're going to have another Prime Minister in the next decade, she's going to come from the right to the centre-right side of the House, because we know that, internationally, I don't know if we've got absolute data on this. New Zealand, I guess we have, that most of the disinformation people are enmeshed in, far right conspiracies. So they're not likely to attack their own nearly so much.
We do have two strong deputy leaders,
yes,
of women, but I think our point about the centre is in there, because another thing I would say is how to hang on to that centre is the toughest thing in the New Zealand context. You've got to do that, and I think just in this case, just because of that shifting context, the centre was lost. But there's a reason why we need to focus on that centre, I think.
mm-hmm.
I've said it a couple of times on the podcast. How do you monetize the middle, right? How do you monetize that? Because Republicans and Democrats compromise today to help the American people. Isn't being clicked, and the extremes are being clicked, and then the algorithm's elevating, and then attitudes and emotions are elevating, and there's something in here, and I'm not wise enough to know what it is, but there also seems to be a sense of it can very quickly, leaders can lose command of the narrative, and very quickly some of these influences, leaders, whether they're leading a Fortune 500 organization or a family-owned business or a country, are going to have to put significant efforts in framing the narrative and commanding the narrative and highlighting the good and highlighting all of the positives that are happening, because billions of dollars are being spent to spin the opposite narrative. It's big business. It's big business. I think keeping us stirred up is big business. Again, no one's clicking on the compromise story. And so I don't know, there's something in there about, did she lose command of the narrative, and then we couldn't adjust quickly enough to ensure that there was a command of the narrative? And I see that happening in the States as well, whether that's the governor of my state and how is he communicating all of the good so that all of that negativity is balanced at least, right? Because then that negativity just takes over, that becomes truth, and people get agitated. I don't know if that resonates or not, but it seems like as I listen to the two of you, there's a loss of some of that narrative that she seemed to have such an incredible command of.
One of the things about her is that she's actually not argumentative. So in parliamentary question time, when she is asked questions, she will come back, if you like, strong about, no, this is what we've done, and this and this and this, and you are wrong to say this and this and this. So she's, she's very assertive in that parliamentary thing. But, when she's asked questions by journalists, her tone is always much more tempered. She doesn't rise to any bait around that stuff. So in some sense, her problem was, damned if she does and damned if she doesn't, right? Because we all know the angry woman kind of trope, so she had to work incredibly hard, under extreme provocation not to do that. Her conduct in the House, accords with the norms of how people conduct themselves in the House generally. So there was that, she kind of couldn't be caught out with criticism on that, and most people don't watch it anyway, is the reality. Yeah.
It's a delicious irony there, Suze, because, people are always complaining about the House and what an appalling.
Yes.
And in fact, a lot of people, when they say, look, I became disengaged with politics, it's because of what I see and hear in the House. And I suppose, Suze, you spent many years in public service. I spent some time in Wellington too. And you see some, that seems to be quite an exception, because there's some really well-meaning people doing some amazing work there too. And unfortunately, most people have no idea. They just see the 30-second thing. And so there's something we could do about that. But it's ironically, it's that disenchantment with the conventional chambers of discussion that have led people to become much more susceptible. Politicians are all, you know what I mean?
Yep.
I do think there is an opportunity, and I guess I'm a chronic optimist. I'm unusual for an academic, I know that. I do think, because, we've had discussions about how do you fight this huge, influence in the internet, etc., and drive. And I suppose because I'm proudly an analog kind of person, not a digital person. I do think that there is something we've got there in terms of our abilities to engage with, let's face it, our students. I mean, I've got 245 LCOM 101 students. There are others, communities. I do think we need to think about, and it's interesting because I've got my stepson from Brazil. He's 17. He's staying with me right now, and I'm amazed what he tells me about what he knows about the world. And I go, where did you get that? And I've been so naive about that. But what I've been doing with him is just taking him to places, showing him stuff, trying to develop his ability to note, to sense, to smell, to not rely on this bloody phone to make sense of the world. So I think we almost have to create compelling alternatives, because the awful phrase that always haunts me in leadership is we get the leaders we deserve. In my respect, what are we doing here? How do we create more sophisticated, more critical consumers of leadership? How do we instill people to say, make your own mind up, use your own data, don't go with what emotionally appeals to your teenage angst or whatever it is. So I just think we've got to rethink, just generally, we've got that opportunity. I'm sure we need to fight in the internet, but I also think we've got a great opportunity. And Suze, my pleasure about being in Aotearoa, the thing I most loved being in Wellington was being able to talk to prime ministers, talk to ministers. You'd line up getting a sandwich, Scott, and you've got the Minister of Finance there, paying $3.50 for a sub the same way you are, and having a chat with them and seeing and just feeling connected on a very basic level about that. And I think the more we can find opportunities to get people to actually make their own decisions based on what they see and hear and are part of. I know it's old school, but I just think that's something I value. It's what I'm really worried, and as an immigrant, it's what I'm really concerned about losing, because it's been so special for me compared to my other experience elsewhere in the world. And so this is vital, but it's our responsibility. What do we do?
I guess my sense is that I do think Ardern will be judged very kindly by historians as probably amongst the best prime ministers that New Zealand has ever had.
Throughout the world.
She's had a significant impact. She's navigated some extremely difficult things incredibly well. And there are many positive lessons we can take, from her approach to leadership, particularly, her centering around values of, an ethics of care and inclusion and being respectful in how she dealt people, combined with her courage to make difficult decisions, and you could see that many of those difficult decisions did weigh heavily upon her. So there is the sense, I think, too, that, in many instances she rose above partisan political consideration. She was very much trying to, if you like, play a statesperson-like role to govern truly in the national interest. But that one of the big lessons as well out of her experience is just how pervasive a factor sexism and misogyny can be for women leaders, and also just how followers, for lack of a better word, can have so many unrealistic expectations as to make a leader's job virtually unbearable. That's a concern. We'll be mining lessons from her for years to come, and I'm sure that she will go on to continue to make some kind of leadership contribution, I suspect, on an international stage, at least partly because it's not terribly safe for her here, which is terrible. Once she's had a bit of a break, there'll be plenty more that she can give, and that she'll continue to be an inspiring role model for many people.
Well, as a leadership scholar, that we are often asked, well, who do you think is a great leader? And she has been my answer. And I think we owe it to her, and we owe it to future leaders who, as Teddy Roosevelt would say, step into the arena to better understand what they're stepping into, the good, the bad, the ugly, to prepare them for some of that work so that they are better prepared to navigate some of that, like I said earlier, to go back to Peter Vale's, the white water that they're going to experience from all directions. And so I really appreciate you two spending some time today and helping us make sense. And I'm sure listeners, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some links to some articles that the two of you suggest people read so that they can better understand the situation and make sense themselves and start to reflect and think about this topic, because it's an important one. And I can't thank you enough. I couldn't have thought of a better way to spend my evening than with the two of you learning.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah. Kia ora, Scott.
Episode 150 of Phronesis was called Stay Curious. And that was a discussion with Tony Middlebrooks. I was reflecting on the first 150 episodes of this project called Phronesis. And I love that title, Stay Curious. What we have here is some individuals trying to make sense of Jacinda Ardern and what she experienced over the course of her role as leader in New Zealand. And there was some incredible good, there was some bad, and there's some ugly. And I said it in the episode, I think the practical wisdom for me is, how do we better prepare leaders for what they're about to experience on any number of different dimensions? Because the work is so gnarly, so complex, that you almost have to be superhuman in some of these instances to be successful. But I think we're staying curious. We're engaging in the dialogue. We're trying to make sense. And we're wandering a little bit at times, but trying to figure out how to do this work better, to better prepare individuals to be successful when leading in informal or formal positions, trying to make a difference, trying to make the world a better place. That's the practical wisdom for me. We need to do a better job of that because it's hard. It's difficult. As always, thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for checking in. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.